Mica and Jacob Miller were the picture-perfect couple. She, the radiant pastor's wife known for her compassion, and he, the magnetic leader of a thriving church. But behind their polished image was a storm of control, secrecy, and fear. When Mica was found dead in a remote North Carolina forest, the world was told it was suicide. Those who knew her best weren't so sure. What began as a tragic loss soon unraveled into a chilling mystery that exposed dark truths no one saw coming. Mica Miller's life appeared from the outside to be the kind others admired. She was active in her church, supportive of her husband's growing ministry, and known in her community as a kind, warm, and engaging woman. People described her as someone who lit up a room, always ready to lend a hand or offer a comforting word. As the wife of Pastor Jacob Miller, a charismatic and widely respected church leader in South Carolina, Mica seemed to represent the ideal of a devoted partner and spiritual leader in her own right. Social media posts showed pictures of church events, mission trips, and family gatherings. Smiling photos painted a picture of unity, love, and purpose. But behind that public image, Mica was carrying something far heavier than anyone realized. On April 27, 2024, news broke that Mica had been found dead in a wooded area of Robeson County, North Carolina. The location was remote, several hours away from her home, and far from any place she was known to frequent. Local law enforcement treated the discovery as a suicide. The initial report stated that she had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and a firearm had been found near her body. Her car was parked nearby, and no signs of struggle or foul play were initially documented. The case, on the surface, appeared straightforward, but those who knew Mica closely were immediately unsettled. The idea of her taking her own life didn't sit right with her friends or family. Mica had been working through personal challenges, yes, but she had also been making plans for the future. She had recently begun speaking out about wanting a new start and distancing herself from certain influences in her life. Just days before her death, she had been seen smiling and laughing with friends, even discussing ideas for upcoming church programs and personal goals she hoped to achieve after her divorce was finalized. She had booked counseling sessions and seemed focused on healing. More than that, Mica had expressed specific fears that something might happen to her. Close friends shared that she had been increasingly anxious, convinced that she was being watched, and worried that someone might try to silence her. She had confided in them, not about depression or despair, but about feeling threatened and unsafe. These weren't the typical behaviors of someone in a mental health crisis. They were the concerns of someone who believed she was in danger. As news of her death spread, online communities quickly lit up with speculation. Some pointed to her estranged husband, questioning the state of their relationship. Others noticed the unusual location of her death and the lack of solid information released by authorities. People began digging, sharing old posts, private messages, and pieces of interviews Mica had given months earlier. It became clear that there was much more to her story than anyone had realized. What began as a heartbreaking tragedy was rapidly evolving into a mystery. And for those who had loved Mica, there was one question louder than all the others. What really happened to her in those final hours? As investigators began to examine the events leading up to Mica Miller's death, their attention inevitably turned to the man who had shared her life for over a decade, Pastor Jacob Miller. Outwardly, Jacob was a pillar of the community. His sermons were powerful, his influence far-reaching. To many, he was a spiritual guide and a charismatic leader who had helped grow a modest church into a thriving congregation. He and Mica were considered a power couple, respected and admired by their followers. But once the spotlight shifted from public appearances to private behavior, a very different picture started to emerge. Mica's friends and family described a marriage that, behind closed doors, was strained and increasingly volatile. Over the last 2 years, Mica had grown more distant from Jacob. According to those closest to her, she had begun to speak out about emotional abuse, subtle manipulation, controlling behavior, and psychological pressure that left her feeling trapped. Although she rarely spoke of physical violence, the emotional toll had become clear. Mica had told friends she felt like she was constantly walking on eggshells, afraid of how her husband would react if she made independent decisions or expressed her own needs. She had made multiple attempts to seek help. Records later revealed that she had contacted authorities more than once, expressing fear for her safety. In one instance, she tried to obtain a restraining order, but it was never granted due to what officials described as insufficient evidence. Despite her pleas, the system failed to intervene effectively. As her marriage deteriorated, Mica moved toward independence. She filed for divorce in early 2024, a move that reportedly enraged Jacob. Witnesses claimed that during this time, his behavior became more erratic. While he maintained a calm and compassionate demeanor in public, those inside the church staff reported growing tension and episodes of anger behind closed doors. Even more troubling were the reports from former church members who had left the congregation in recent years. They described Jacob as controlling, with an unhealthy level of influence over his followers. One former member alleged that questioning his decisions could lead to public shaming or quiet removal from leadership positions. Others mentioned a culture of silence within the church, where concerns about Jacob's behavior were dismissed or ignored. These testimonies painted a disturbing backdrop to Mica's final months. What raised further suspicion was Jacob's reaction after Mica's death. At a time when most would be grieving, he was calm, composed, and quick to assert that she had taken her own life. His public statements emphasized her supposed struggles with mental health, casting her as someone who had been spiraling in private. But those who knew her best said this portrayal didn't align with the woman they had spoken to just days before her death. She had sounded hopeful, motivated, and ready to move forward. The inconsistencies deepened when investigators reviewed Jacob's version of events and compared them to phone records and surveillance footage. Several key details didn't line up. He claimed to be home at specific times, but his phone had been active miles away. Calls were placed, texts deleted, and timelines blurred. As more inconsistencies emerged, suspicion began to build. Mica's death no longer looked like a tragic ending. It was beginning to look like a carefully constructed illusion. The most puzzling aspect of Mica Miller's death was the location where her body was found. Robeson County, North Carolina, was over 2 hours away from her home in South Carolina. She had no known friends, family, or business in the area. It was a quiet, rural region surrounded by forested land and rarely traveled roads. A place where someone might go to disappear, or more chillingly, be taken. The question of why Mica would have driven there on her own quickly became one of the most pressing concerns for investigators. Surveillance footage showed Mica's car on the highway heading toward Robeson County earlier that day. She appeared to be alone in the vehicle, and there were no signs of distress. However, what stood out was the absence of any stops during the drive. There were no recorded fuel purchases, no restaurant visits, no visible breaks in her journey. Her cell phone stopped transmitting data around 2:15 p.m., just as she entered a stretch of road with little to no cell service. After that, there was complete digital silence. For someone who had been constantly connected and responsive in the days leading up to her death, this sudden blackout raised immediate concerns. When her vehicle was eventually located at the edge of a wooded trail, it was neatly parked with the driver's seat adjusted to her height. Her personal belongings, including her phone, purse, and a small bag, were found inside the car. The keys were still in the ignition, but the vehicle was turned off. The area where she was found was quiet and isolated, with no houses or buildings nearby. It was not the kind of place someone would stumble upon by accident. Whoever had ended up there had done so with intention. The weapon found near her body was a registered handgun, but it lacked any fingerprints. This was not typical for a suicide case. Forensic experts noted that even in situations involving gloves, partial prints or smudges are usually found. Here, the gun appeared to have been thoroughly wiped clean. This detail shifted the tone of the investigation from tragedy to possible foul play. The idea that Mica had taken her own life, once accepted as fact, began to look more like a convenient narrative. Another disturbing clue came from the location data pulled from Jacob Miller's phone. Investigators discovered that his phone had pinged a tower less than 5 miles from where Mica's body was found on the same afternoon she died. This directly contradicted his earlier statements that he had been at home all day. When questioned, Jacob offered a vague explanation, claiming he had driven to the area in search of her after receiving a worrying message. But no such message could be found on either of their devices, and more importantly, there was no record of him contacting authorities or Mica's family about her being missing. With each new piece of information, the theory of suicide seemed less likely. The location, the silence, the wiped gun, and Jacob's conflicting alibi all pointed to something far more sinister. Mica hadn't simply vanished, she had been led or taken to a place where no one would find her until it was too late. As the investigation pushed deeper into the circumstances surrounding Mica Miller's death, a disturbing web of secrecy and manipulation began to unravel. The most telling shift came when a new witness emerged, an anonymous source who claimed to have once worked closely with the Millers during their ministry's peak. He described himself as a personal assistant, but what he revealed went far beyond administrative duties. According to his statement, part of his role had been to monitor Mica's activities during the final months of her marriage. He had been asked to follow her, gather information, and report back to Jacob. This revelation stunned investigators. It introduced the possibility that Mica had been under surveillance in the weeks leading up to her death. The assistant went on to allege that Jacob had grown increasingly obsessed with controlling the narrative around Mica, especially as the divorce proceedings moved forward. He claimed Jacob feared that Mica would go public with damaging information about their marriage and the inner workings of the church. Her growing independence, her outreach to lawyers, and her documented attempts to obtain a protective order all seemed to feed Jacob's desperation to maintain control. Further examination of Mica's mental health records revealed troubling inconsistencies. A document found in her home, appearing to be a journal entry written in her hand, spoke of despair and hopelessness. At first glance, it supported the theory of suicide. However, handwriting experts were brought in to verify its authenticity. Their analysis revealed that the entry had likely been copied, painstakingly traced or mimicked, from older notebooks Mica had written years earlier. This suggested deliberate forgery. Someone had gone through the effort of faking an emotional breakdown on paper. Even more disturbing were the tampered files in Mica's medical history. Records had been altered to include diagnoses she had never received. Therapists she had never visited were listed as providers. These changes appeared to have been inserted recently, likely after her death, which meant someone had accessed her private records in an effort to reinforce a specific narrative that Mica was unstable, depressed, and unwell. But the forensic trail was sloppy. Digital timestamps and login data exposed the intrusion. It was no longer a theory, it was documented manipulation. As the investigation gathered momentum, multiple former members of Jacob's church began coming forward. They spoke of a toxic environment, built on fear and silence. One described being pressured to delete social media posts that questioned Jacob's behavior. Another claimed to have been offered money to speak favorably about Mica's fragile mental state to reporters. Each account added weight to the idea that Mica's death had not only been concealed, but also orchestrated behind a carefully crafted public image. Still, despite growing evidence, there was no direct link tying Jacob to the moment of Mica's death. Without a confession, witnesses, or video footage, investigators faced a difficult challenge. The pieces were aligning to form a chilling picture, but proving it in a court of law would require more. Meanwhile, Mica's loved ones, armed with these new discoveries, began to fight publicly for the truth, determined not to let her story be silenced like her voice had been. As pressure mounted and the evidence against Jacob Miller continued to accumulate, law enforcement finally made their move. He was arrested and charged with obstruction of justice and evidence tampering in connection to Mica Miller's death. The public reaction was swift and divided. Some in the community stood by Jacob, insisting he was a victim of character assassination. Others, especially those who had known Mica personally, believed justice was finally catching up with a man who had long operated without accountability. But as the case proceeded to court, the reality of the legal system became painfully clear. Proving murder without definitive evidence is an uphill battle. Prosecutors presented a compelling case built on circumstantial evidence. They laid out Jacob's inconsistencies, the altered medical records, the forged journal entry, and the suspicious cell phone data, placing him near the scene of Mica's death. They highlighted the anonymous assistant's testimony and the statements from former church members who described a pattern of control and manipulation. All of it painted Jacob as a man desperate to protect his image and willing to destroy anyone who threatened it, including his wife. However, Jacob's defense team was relentless. They argued that the surveillance footage showed Mica driving alone, her car arriving at the location without signs of pursuit. They claimed the assistant was an unreliable source with personal grievances. As for the altered records, the defense blamed overzealous church volunteers acting without Jacob's direct knowledge. They painted Mica as someone who had long struggled internally and had simply reached a breaking point, despite appearances. The most significant challenge for the prosecution was the lack of direct physical evidence linking Jacob to the act itself. There were no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, and no conclusive proof that he had been with Mica at the time of her death. The wiped gun remained a troubling clue, but it alone couldn't convict him. After weeks of legal arguments, testimony, and public speculation, the trial concluded with a mixed verdict. Jacob Miller was found guilty of obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence, but not guilty of murder. The court sentenced him to a brief prison term, citing his role in misleading investigators and altering documents after Mica's death. For many, the outcome was a bitter pill to swallow. The man suspected of orchestrating one of the most chilling cases in recent memory would serve only a few years behind bars, with the official ruling on Mica's death still classified as suicide. Outside the courthouse, protests erupted. Supporters of Mica held signs, lit candles, and chanted her name. Her family issued a statement expressing deep disappointment in the verdict, but vowed to continue their fight for the truth. They believed, as many did, that justice had only been half served. The unanswered questions, the inconsistencies, and the haunting details left behind still pointed to a story far darker than the court acknowledged. To this day, the strange case of Mica Miller remains unresolved in the minds of many. It is a story of a life lost too soon, a system that fell short, and a truth buried beneath image and power. What really happened in those final moments may never be fully known, but the impact of Mica's story lives on, urging others to speak, to question, and to never look away.